7-year-old Toby Banks climbed into the passenger seat of the rusted Ford F-150, and the sound of his stomach growling was louder than the engine sputtering to life in the freezing Michigan air. Outside, the gray November sky over Silver Creek threatened a snowstorm, the kind that buried everything in silence. But inside the cab, the silence between father and son felt heavier than any drift of snow. Carter Banks shifted the truck into gear, his eyes lingering on his son for a moment too long. At 38, Carter was a man who built things: security systems, firewalls, safe havens for others, but looking at Toby, he felt a crack in his own foundation. The boy looked smaller today. His navy blue school polo, usually a crisp fit, seemed to hang loosely off his small shoulders, and his eyes, typically bright with the curiosity of a second grader, were dull and sunken. Toby clutched his vintage metal lunchbox, the one with Captain America on the lid that had belonged to his mother, as if it were a shield. It sat on his lap, disturbingly light. It didn't rattle with the weight of leftovers or an empty thermos. It just sounded hollow. "Rough day, little man?" Carter asked, keeping his voice light, trying to bridge the gap. He turned up the heat, the old vents groaning as they pumped warm air into the cab. Toby shrugged, staring out the window at the passing maple trees, now stripped bare by the coming winter. "It was okay," he whispered. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Carter pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story colonial. It wasn't the mansion Carter could afford as the CEO of Banks Security Solutions. He could buy half the town if he wanted, but it was the home his late wife, Sarah, had loved. It was safe. Or at least he thought it was. As soon as they stepped inside, the facade broke. Toby didn't run to the living room to watch cartoons. He didn't ask to play catch. He dropped his backpack by the door and made a beeline for the kitchen. Carter followed, frowning, as Toby tore open the pantry door. The boy's hands were shaking as he grabbed a granola bar, ripping the wrapper with his teeth and devouring it in 3 desperate bites. Before he had even swallowed the last piece, he was reaching for another. "Whoa, slow down, Tobes," Carter said, stepping forward and placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Under his palm, he could feel the sharp ridge of the boy's collarbone. A cold knot formed in Carter's stomach. "Save some room for dinner. Didn't you eat lunch?" Toby froze. The second granola bar crinkled in his fist. He didn't turn around. I forgot." "You forgot." Carter knelt, turning Toby to face him. "Toby, look at me." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and tapped open the school's parent portal app. The screen glowed with the account details. Balance: $500. Last transaction, October 28th. That was over 2 weeks ago. Carter's heart hammered against his ribs. His son hadn't purchased a meal in 14 days. "Toby," Carter's voice was steady, but his eyes were searching. "The account is full. Did you lose your card? Did someone take it?" Toby looked down at his sneakers, his grip on the granola bar tightening until it turned to crumbs. He looked at the vintage lunchbox sitting on the counter, the symbol of the mother who wasn't there to protect him. Tears welled up in his big brown eyes, spilling over onto his cheeks. Toby's voice trembled, a whisper so quiet Carter almost missed it. "I wasn't hungry, Dad." It was a lie. A clumsy, heartbreaking lie from a child who was clearly starving. Carter didn't push. He pulled his son into a hug, feeling the terrifying fragility of the boy's frame against his chest. Later that night, after Toby had eaten a dinner portion meant for a grown man and fallen asleep at the kitchen table from sheer exhaustion, Carter carried him to bed. He tucked the duvet around his son, brushing a hand over Toby's forehead. He walked downstairs to his office and sat in the dark, the glow of the school portal reflected in his eyes. His son was lying to protect someone, or out of fear. Carter Banks had spent his life securing data, but he had failed to secure the one thing that mattered most. He touched the boy's thin shoulder in his mind and made a silent vow to the empty room. He would find out why his son was starving, and God help whoever was responsible. The phone line to Silver Creek Elementary hummed with a generic hold music that felt like a polite way of saying, "We don't care." Carter Banks sat in his home office, gripping his smartphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was 8:15 a.m. Outside, the Michigan frost was still clinging to the window panes, blurring the world into shades of cold gray. Inside, the warmth of the house felt suffocatingly artificial against the chill settling in Carter's chest. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, Sarah, laughing on a beach, her eyes crinkled in pure joy. She had been the diplomat, the one who knew how to talk to teachers and doctors with grace. Carter was the firewall. He stopped threats. He didn't negotiate with them. But for Toby, he had to try. Finally, the music cut out. "Mr. Banks." The voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with a condescension that Carter recognized instantly. It was Principal Leonard Fitz. "I've looked into your concerns regarding the lunch account." "And?" Carter asked, keeping his voice level. "You saw the transaction history? 0 purchases in 2 weeks. My son is coming home starving, Mr. Fitz. He's lost weight." "Mr. Banks, please, let's not be dramatic." Fitz sighed, the sound of papers shuffling audible over the line. "I spoke with our cafeteria manager, Mrs. Crouch. She assures me everything is normal. Children at this age, they barter. Maybe Toby is trading his lunch for toys, or perhaps he's simply throwing it away to rush out to recess. It happens more often than you'd think, especially with children from single-parent households. Sometimes they just seek attention." The accusation hung in the air, veiled but sharp. Negligent father. Broken home. Carter closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "My son isn't trading food, Leonard. He's hungry. He's eating dry granola bars like they're a lifeline. I want you to check the cameras. We don't monitor the cafeteria for lunch habits, Mr. Banks. We have privacy policies. Look, just pack him a sandwich if you're so worried. I have a district meeting to prepare for." The line went dead before Carter could respond. He stared at the phone, the silence of the room amplifying his rage. They weren't going to help. In fact, they had already decided who he was, a blue-collar widower driving a rusted truck, probably overwhelmed and confused. They had no idea who they were actually hanging up on. Carter stood up and walked to the heavy oak bookshelf in the corner. He pulled a specific book, a thick volume on cybersecurity, and a hidden panel in the wall clicked open. Behind it was a safe. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. Beep. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing rows of hard drives, encrypted tablets, and prototypes that hadn't even hit the military market yet. This was the heart of Bank Security Solutions. He reached for a small, velvet-lined box. Inside sat a single black button. To the naked eye, it was just a piece of plastic, identical to the ones on a standard winter coat. But under a microscope, it was a masterpiece of engineering. A 4K wide-angle lens, a high-fidelity microphone, and a transmitter capable of streaming encrypted data to a cloud server in real time. He had designed it for undercover journalists reporting from war zones. Now, he would use it for a war zone of a different kind. "Daddy!" Carter jumped, snapping the box shut and sliding the panel closed. Toby stood in the doorway, dressed in his school uniform. He looked even smaller in the morning light, his face pale. "Hey, pal," Carter said, his voice softening instantly. He grabbed a sewing kit from the desk drawer, a skill he'd learned in the army, and perfected when buttons fell off Toby's shirts after Sarah passed. "Come here. I noticed a button on your coat was loose yesterday. Can't have you freezing out there." Toby walked over obediently, dragging his feet. Carter knelt, removing the top button of Toby's navy blue winter jacket and deftly threading the needle. His large, rough hands moved with surprising delicacy. As he sewed the camera button into place, he looked at his son. "Toby, I need you to know something. You're not in trouble. Whatever happens, I'm right here with you. Okay?" Toby nodded, but his eyes darted away, filled with that same terrified secrecy from the day before. He didn't believe it. "Not yet." "There," Carter said, biting the thread. He zipped the coat up to Toby's chin. "Fits perfect." He pulled out his phone, tapping a hidden app. The screen flickered, then stabilized. A crystal-clear view of Carter's own face appeared, looking up from the button's perspective. The audio feed picked up the sound of Toby's shallow breathing. "You look tough," Carter smiled, smoothing the collar. "Brave. Just like Captain America." Toby touched the vintage lunchbox in his hand, a small, sad smile ghosting his lips. "Okay, Dad." They walked to the front door. The yellow school bus was already idling at the corner, its exhaust puffing white clouds into the freezing air. Carter watched his son trudge down the driveway, a small blue figure against the gray landscape. He wanted to run after him, to pull him back inside and promise he never had to go back to that place. But he couldn't. He needed proof. He needed to burn their lies to the ground so they could never hurt Toby or any other kid again. Carter watched the live feed initialize on his screen, his heart pounding against his ribs as the yellow bus pulled away. "I'm with you, son," he whispered to the empty room. The cafeteria smelled of bleach and overcooked tater tots, a distinct, suffocating scent that seemed to radiate through the high-definition screen sitting on Carter Banks's mahogany desk. It was a smell that should have signaled nourishment and midday relief for a child, but as Carter watched the live feed streaming from the button on his son's coat, it made his own stomach churn with a nausea born of pure dread. It was 11:45 a.m. Carter sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn against the harsh daylight. On his monitor, the world was shaking slightly with every step Toby took. The camera's wide-angle lens captured the chaotic sea of elementary school life, brightly colored puffer jackets, the blur of running sneakers, and the deafening cacophony of shrill voices bouncing off cinder block walls. To anyone else, it was just a lunch period. To Carter, it was a crime scene in progress. He watched as Toby joined the end of the lunch line. The queue moved agonizingly slow. Through the lens, Carter saw what Toby saw. He saw the backs of other children, relaxed and chatting, unaware of the invisible weight pressing down on the boy behind them. As the line shuffled forward, a figure came into view behind the plexiglass sneeze guard. Mrs. Dolores Crouch. Even through a digital feed, she was an imposing figure. With stiff, graying hair and an apron that looked clinically white, she moved with the efficient, sharp, jerky motions of someone who tolerated children rather than cared for them. Carter leaned in, his eyes narrowing. He watched as a blonde girl in front of Toby stepped up. Dolores's face transformed instantly, a sugary, doting smile appearing as if a switch had been flipped. "There you go, sweetie," Dolores cooed, the high-fidelity microphone picking up every syllable. She placed a tray with spaghetti, a bread roll, and a chocolate milk carton on the counter. Then, with a conspiratorial wink, she reached into a plastic bin and added a second roll. "You're growing so fast, you need your strength. Tell your mama I said hello at church on Sunday." The girl giggled, grabbed her tray, and skipped away. Then Toby stepped up. The change in the atmosphere was so abrupt it felt like a drop in cabin pressure. Dolores's smile didn't just fade, it evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated contempt. She looked down at the camera at Toby with eyes that were cold and hard as flint. "You again," she muttered, the warmth in her voice replaced by a sneer. "Hi, Mrs. Crouch." Toby's voice was small, trembling. The camera tilted down slightly as his hand came into view, holding out his blue lunch card. He placed it on the scanner. Beep. Carter watched the small green light on the register flash. Approved. The account had $500. He knew it. The system knew it. But Dolores didn't look at the screen. She stared at the vintage metal lunchbox Toby was clutching in his other hand, the Captain America tin that Sarah had found at a flea market years ago. To Toby, it was a shield. To Dolores, it seemed to be an insult. "That noisy piece of junk," she hissed, shaking her head. She pressed a button on her side of the register. A red light flashed. Cancelled. Declined. Again. "But," Toby's voice cracked. "My dad said he put money in. He checked it." "Your dad?" Dolores let out a sharp, cruel laugh that grated against Carter's nerves like sandpaper. She leaned over the counter, looming large in the frame. "Let me tell you something about how the world works, boy. Just because your daddy drives a truck doesn't mean he pays his bills. The computer says 0. And we don't feed freeloaders here." Carter's hand gripped the edge of his desk, so hard the wood groaned under the pressure. He wasn't just watching bullying. He was watching a systematic dismantling of his son's spirit. In the background of the frame, he caught a glimpse of Henry, the elderly janitor. The old man had paused his sweeping, looking toward the counter with eyes full of sorrow and fear. He knew. He clearly knew this was happening, but he lowered his head and kept sweeping, terrified of the woman who held court behind the register. Please, Mrs. Crouch, Toby whispered. I'm really hungry. Dolores sighed, an exaggerated sound of annoyance. She picked up a tray she had already prepped with a scoop of pasta and an apple. For a second, Carter thought she might have a shred of humanity left. She held it out, hovering it just within Toby's reach. Toby's hand reached up for it. Then she pulled it back. Oops, she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. With a flick of her wrist, she tilted the tray over the large gray trash bin beside her. The pasta slid off with a wet plop. The apple followed with a hollow thud. Looks like it's gone. What a waste. But rules are rules. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was meant only for Toby, but the hidden microphone caught it with devastating clarity. You people always think you can scam the system. Go sit down before I call the principal and tell him you're holding up the line for the real students. The camera shook violently as Toby flinched. He turned away, head hung low. The feed showed his feet shuffling across the linoleum floor, past tables of laughing children eating their fill, past the smell of fresh rolls he wasn't allowed to touch. He walked to the far corner of the cafeteria, sat down at an empty table, and placed his empty Captain America lunchbox in front of him. He didn't open it. He just folded his hands on the table and stared at the metal lid. In his office, Carter Banks stopped the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the monitor across the room. He went unnervingly still. A cold, dangerous calm settled over him, the kind of calm that precedes a catastrophic storm. He saved the file, timestamped it, and encrypted it into a folder labeled evidence_day_01. His eyes were dry, but his soul was burning with a fury that could reduce this entire town to ash. He had the proof. Now, he just needed to make sure that when he struck back, they wouldn't just be fired. They would be obliterated. The meeting in Principal Leonard Fitz's office didn't feel like a discussion about a child's welfare. It felt like an interrogation where the victim was the one on trial. The room itself was designed to intimidate, filled with heavy polished oak furniture and walls adorned with framed certificates of educational excellence and photos of Fitz shaking hands with local politicians. The air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, a sterile scent that barely masked the underlying rot of bureaucracy. Carter Banks sat in a low, uncomfortable chair across from the massive desk, intentionally dressed in his faded work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He kept his posture slumped slightly, playing the part they expected, the tired, blue-collar widower who didn't understand the complexities of administrative policy. But beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were sharp, recording every detail, every micro-expression on Fitz's face. Mr. Banks, Fitz began, lacing his fingers together on the desk. He offered a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. I understand you're upset. We all want what's best for Toby. But barging in here without an appointment, it's highly irregular. My son isn't eating, Mr. Fitz, Carter said, his voice rough. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black tablet, an item that looked slightly out of place with the rest of his attire. And yesterday I found out why. He slid the tablet across the polished wood. He pressed play. The video from the button camera played in high definition. Dolores's voice filled the quiet office, sharp and cruel. We don't feed freeloaders here. Go sit down before I call the principal. Then came the sound of the food hitting the trash. The silence of the humiliated child. Carter watched Fitz closely. He expected shock. He expected horror. He expected an apology. Instead, he saw calculation. Fitz watched the screen for less than 10 seconds before his eyes darted away, not to Carter, but to the door, ensuring it was closed. He reached out and paused the video, his expression hardening. Where did you get this? Fitz asked, his voice dropping an octave. This footage. Who filmed this? I did, Carter replied calmly. Or rather, my son's coat did. I needed to know the truth. Fitz pushed the tablet back across the desk as if it were contaminated evidence. He leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking under his weight, and sighed with the exaggerated patience of a man explaining quantum physics to a toddler. Mr. Banks, I'm going to be frank with you. You have just committed a very serious violation. Recording a school employee without their consent? On school property? That is a breach of privacy laws. It's entrapment. Entrapment, Carter repeated, fighting the urge to laugh bitterly. She starved a 7-year-old boy. She dumped his food in the garbage because of who we are. That's child abuse, Leonard. Not a privacy violation. Mrs. Crouch has been with this district for 20 years. Fitz snapped, his veneer of politeness cracking. She is a pillar of this community. Her family serves on the school board. What I see here is a stressful moment taken out of context, manipulated by a father who perhaps doesn't understand the pressures our staff faces. You're looking for a payday, aren't you? The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Carter sat very still. I want her fired. I want an investigation. Fitz chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Carter's rusted Ford truck was parked next to the sleek sedans of the staff. Let me tell you what's going to happen, Mr. Banks. You're going to delete that footage. You're going to stop harassing my staff. If you persist with this slander, I will be forced to involve the district's legal team. Fitz turned back, his face shadowing in the dim light. And frankly, if Toby is struggling this much to fit in, if his home life is so chaotic that his father has to resort to spy games, maybe Silver Creek isn't the right environment for him. Child Protective Services takes a dim view of unstable households. It was a threat, clear and simple. Shut up, or we take your son. Carter stood up slowly. He retrieved his tablet, slipping it back into his pocket. His hand brushed against the USB drive. He had prepared the one containing the full unedited files. He didn't hand it over. Not yet. The trap wasn't fully sprung. I see, Carter said, his voice terrifyingly neutral. So, the system protects its own. The system protects order, Mr. Banks. Fitz corrected, checking his watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a very important day tomorrow. We have the CEO of Bank Security Solutions coming to sign a multi-million-dollar contract to upgrade our campus safety. That is grown-up business. It's vital for the school's future. I don't have time for petty cafeteria squabbles. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Carter paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at the small man in the big chair. Bank security, Carter mused. I hear they have very high standards. You think the signing is still on? Fitz sneered, waving a dismissive hand. Don't worry your head about it, Mr. Banks. It's way above your pay grade. Just make sure Toby brings a sandwich tomorrow. Carter walked out of the office, down the long waxed hallway lined with student art that hypocritically proclaimed kindness matters. He didn't look back. He walked out into the biting November wind, climbed into his truck, and slammed the door, sealing himself inside his mobile fortress. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number stored as headquarters. Mr. Banks, his assistant's voice answered on the first ring. Carter watched the school building through his windshield, his eyes cold and focused. Cancel my morning meetings tomorrow. And tell the AV team to prep the mobile command unit. We're going to the assembly myself. Sir? The contract signing. Oh, we're going to the signing, Carter said, starting the engine. But bring the press kit. And make sure the local news affiliates are there. We're going live at 9 a.m. He drove away, the gravel crunching under his tires like the bones of the corrupt administration he was about to dismantle. They thought they were dealing with a helpless father. They had no idea they had just declared war on the wrong man. The Silver Creek Elementary Auditorium was buzzing with an anticipation that felt electric, vibrating against the high, vaulted ceiling. It was the kind of staged perfection that Principal Fitz lived for. A massive vinyl banner hung above the stage, emblazoned with the words, Welcome Bank Security Solutions, partnering for a safer future. In the front row, the local press sat with cameras ready, invited under the pretense of a historic district announcement. To the right, the school board members sat in stiff rows, beaming with self-importance. And there, standing near the stage entrance like a queen surveying her kingdom, was Mrs. Dolores Crouch. She wore her Sunday best, a floral dress that clashed violently with the kindness posters on the walls, and smirked at the parents filing in. She had won. The troublemaker father had been silenced, and today was about glory. On stage, Principal Leonard Fitz stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, the feedback whine quickly silenced, and flashed his most charming smile. He looked impeccable in his suit, though a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. This contract was his ticket to a promotion, a legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, parents, and distinguished guests, Fitz's voice boomed, smooth as silk. Today marks a new dawn for Silver Creek. We pride ourselves on excellence, on integrity, and on creating a nurturing environment for every child. That is why we are honored to announce our partnership with the state's leading cybersecurity firm, Bank Security Solutions. Their CEO, a man of great vision, has generously agreed to overhaul our entire safety infrastructure. He paused for applause. The room clapped politely. He is a man of mystery, usually avoiding the spotlight, Fitz continued, chuckling. But we are hoping he will join us today to sign the papers. Please welcome. The double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open with a heavy thud that echoed through the hall. The applause faltered, then died out completely. Heads turned. Whispers started like a brush fire. Walking down the center aisle was not the man Principal Fitz had met yesterday, the tired widower in a faded Carhartt jacket and a baseball cap. It was Carter Banks. But this Carter was transformed. He was wearing a bespoke, charcoal gray Italian suit that fit his broad frame perfectly. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, clicking rhythmically against the floor. He didn't walk with a slump. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the room before he even entered it. Flanked on either side of him were two serious-looking men in suits carrying briefcases, and behind them, a camera crew from the state's largest news network, broadcasting live. Fitz squinted against the stage lights. His smile wavered. "Excuse me, sir? This is a private event. Security, please escort this man out." Dolores stepped forward from the side, her face twisting in recognition. "It's him," she hissed loud enough for the front row to hear. "It's the father. The troublemaker." Carter didn't stop. He walked straight past the confused school security guard, who took one look at Carter's entourage and decided not to intervene. Carter climbed the stairs to the stage. He loomed over the podium, forcing Fitz to take a step back. The microphone picked up Fitz's nervous breathing. "You were waiting for the CEO of Bank Security?" Carter asked. His voice was calm, amplified through the speakers, deep and resonant. He turned to face the crowd, then looked back at Fitz with eyes that were cold enough to freeze hell over. "I'm right here, Leonard." A gasp rippled through the audience. Fitz went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mr. Banks? But you drive a truck." I drive a truck because it reminds me where I came from," Carter interrupted, cutting him down. "And I came here to sign a contract based on shared values. Integrity, protection, care." He signaled to his assistant in the wings. "But before I sign anything, I think the parents and the press should see exactly what kind of values this administration protects." "No." Fitz lunged for the microphone, panic seizing him. "Cut the feed. Turn it off." But it was too late. Carter's team had already hijacked the AV system. The massive projection screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the school logo, flickered black. Then, a timestamp appeared. November 14th, 11:48 a.m. The video played. The sound was crystal clear, booming through the auditorium speakers. Dolores's voice, sharp and hateful, sliced through the air. "You people always think you can scam the system." On the giant screen, every parent, every reporter, every board member watched a 7-year-old boy beg for food. They watched Dolores crouch, the woman standing 10 feet away, sneer at a child. They watched her take a tray of hot food paid for by his father and dump it deliberately into the trash. Oops. Looks like it's gone. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, heavier than the grave. Then came the sound of a child's quiet sob from the speakers. Dolores Crouch stood frozen, her face draining of all color until she looked like a ghost. She backed away, shaking her head, mouthing, No, that's not." The video cut to the office meeting from yesterday. Principal Fitz's face appeared, 10 feet tall. "The system protects order, Mr. Banks. If you persist, I will be forced to involve the legal team. Maybe Silver Creek isn't the right environment for him." The crowd erupted. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was a roar of outrage. Parents stood up, shouting. Reporters flashed their cameras blindingly, capturing the sheer terror on Fitz's face. Carter leaned into the microphone one last time. My company protects people, Mr. Fitz. You hurt them. You starve children to feed your own ego. And you, he pointed a finger at Dolores, who was now trembling against the stage curtain, you judged a book by its cover. You thought I was nobody. You thought my son didn't matter. He reached into his inner pocket, pulling out the contract the multi-million-dollar document Fitz had been salivating over. With a slow, deliberate motion, Carter tore it in half, then in quarters. He let the pieces flutter to the stage floor like confetti at a funeral. The deal is off. From the back of the auditorium, the heavy doors opened again. This time it wasn't a CEO. It was the police. Four officers marched down the aisle, led by a detective who looked grim. They headed straight for the stage. Leonard Fitz, Dolores Crouch. The detective shouted over the noise of the crowd. You are under arrest for child endangerment, fraud, and civil rights violations. As the handcuffs clicked around Dolores's wrists, she looked out at the sea of angry faces and finally saw Carter Banks. He wasn't looking at her with anger anymore. He was looking at her with pity. He stood center stage, amidst the flashbulbs and the shouting, a father who had burned down the fortress to save his son. The verdict had been delivered, and it was absolute. The snow finally fell on Silver Creek, covering the ugly secrets of the past week in a blanket of pristine white. It was Thanksgiving Day, and the world outside the Banks' colonial home looked like a painting, quiet, clean, and peaceful. The biting wind that had cut through Carter's jacket a week ago had softened into a gentle drift of flakes that settled on the roof of his Ford truck and the police cruisers that had finally left the school parking lot. But inside the house, the air wasn't cold. It was thick with the rich, savory scent of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and melted butter, the smell of a home that had healed. In the living room, the television was playing quietly in the background. A local news anchor, her face far less grim than it had been days ago, was summarizing the fallout of what the nation was now calling the lunchbox verdict. The headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Former principal stripped of license. Cafeteria manager faces charges. Justice had been swift. Without the protection of the corrupt school board, which had dissolved in shame, Dolores Crouch was facing 18 months in prison for child endangerment. Leonard Fitz would never work in education again. The system that had protected them had cracked under the weight of one father's undeniable proof. Carter picked up the remote and turned the TV off. The war was over. It was time for peace. Mr. Banks, a hesitant voice called from the kitchen doorway. Carter turned to see Henry, the school's elderly janitor, standing there clutching a worn tweed cap in his hands. He looked out of place in the warmth of the house, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and shyness. Carter had tracked him down personally, inviting him not as an employee, but as a guest of honor. Please, Henry, it's Carter, he said, walking over and placing a firm, welcoming hand on the older man's shoulder. And thank you for coming. I know you tried to help Toby when you could. I saw you in the footage. You were the only one who looked sad. Henry's eyes misted over. I was scared, sir. I needed the job. But watching that boy go hungry, it broke my heart every day. I'm just glad you fought back. Most people just look away. Not anymore, Carter said firmly. Come on. Dinner is ready. They moved to the dining room table, which was set with the finest china Sarah had left them. But right there, next to Toby's plate, sat the vintage Captain America lunchbox. It wasn't battered or hidden in a backpack anymore. It was polished, gleaming under the chandelier lights. Toby came running in, his cheeks flushed with color, a stark contrast to the pale, hollow-eyed ghost he had been a week ago. He climbed into his chair, his legs swinging happily. He looked at Henry and grinned. Hi, Mr. Henry. Dad made stuffing. I see that, Toby, Henry smiled, relaxing for the first time. Before they ate, Carter stood up, raising a glass of sparkling cider. I have one more announcement, he said, looking at his son. Toby, you know the money we got from the lawsuit? The settlement. Toby nodded, mouth full of a bread roll he was already devouring. We aren't keeping it, Carter announced. I've used it to start a foundation. It's called Toby's Table. Starting Monday, Bank Security is funding a new program for Silver Creek and every school in the county. Free hot lunch for every single student, No questions asked. No cards. No accounts. No shame. Just food. Henry gasped, dropping his fork. Mr. Banks, that's millions. It's necessary, Carter shrugged. No child should ever have to wonder if they eat today. Toby stopped chewing. He looked at his dad, his eyes shining. He reached for the metal lunchbox on the table. For weeks, opening it had been a source of anxiety, a reminder of emptiness. But today, he popped the latch with confidence. Click. It wasn't empty. And it wasn't full of food. Inside, nestled on the velvet lining Carter had installed, was a framed photograph of Carter and Toby, taken just yesterday, standing in the snow, both smiling genuine, unburdened smiles. "I'm not hungry anymore, Dad," Toby whispered, tracing the photo with his finger. He looked up, and for the first time in 2 years, the shadow of grief and hunger was completely gone from his face. "But I'm gonna eat it all." Carter laughed, a sound that felt rusty but good. "You better." "Happy Thanksgiving, son." As they ate, the room filled with the sounds of silverware clinking and laughter, the music of a living family. Carter leaned back in his chair, looking past the warmth of the table, past the reflection in the window, out to the snowy yard where a single maple tree stood tall against the winter sky. It had lost its leaves. Its bark was rough and weathered, but its roots were deep and alive. "We judge a tree by its fruit, not its bark," he whispered to the empty space beside him, knowing Sarah was listening. "We're okay now, honey. We're okay." Just as the fresh snow settled over Silver Creek, bringing peace to a father and son, we are reminded that true character is never defined by the clothes we wear or the car we drive. Carter Banks showed us that the greatest power lies not in status, but in the quiet courage to stand up against injustice for those we love. As you go about your day, may you remember to look a little closer at the people around you, for sometimes a heart of gold is hidden beneath a faded coat.